It is commonly believed that being in crowded places guarantees a higher level of safety and significantly reduces the risk of becoming a victim of a criminal attack. Statistics support this thesis, but nothing can prevent a criminal from insidiously luring their victim to a deserted place in order to carry out their terrible intentions. The story in question happened in the small Italian town of Andria. This town, where about 100,000 people live, is famous for its rich historical heritage. The main attraction for travelers in the town is rightfully considered the ancient castle of Castel del Monte. Near this architectural monument lived the Mansi family. The couple was raising their only daughter, 8-year-old Graziella, who was a long-awaited and infinitely desired addition to the family. The Mansi family belonged to a cohort of enterprising businessmen who focused on meeting the needs of numerous tourists. About 10 years ago, they opened their own outdoor outlet where they sold nuts, dried fruits and other snacks. Their shop was located in an extremely advantageous place, not far from the main entrance to the castle, so the business brought a good income. Despite her young age, little Graziella often helped her parents with work. From an early age, the girl joined the family business, which greatly pleased her relatives. The older members of the family worked at one of the central tourist locations of the city, where there was a continuous flow of visitors, which was sometimes difficult to handle. The child's help became invaluable, and Graziella herself loved feeling part of the joint business. The girl was distinguished by a sociable disposition and cheerfulness, so she was remembered by many buyers who often visited the Mansi shop. August 19, 2000 turned out to be an ordinary Saturday, when the tourist flow reached its peak. For the Mansi family, working on weekends was more the norm than the exception. On such days, Graziella's grandfather usually stayed behind the counter. The girl willingly kept him company, helping with small errands. After all, an endless human stream was heading towards the castle, so it seemed unreal to leave the outlet even for a moment. Around 7 in the evening, the elderly man asked his granddaughter for a favor. Tired after a whole day, he turned to Graziella with a request to go to the fountain to fill a small bottle with water. The girl gladly agreed and set off in the indicated direction. It would take no more than 5 minutes to walk to the destination, but for some reason Graziella was delayed, which immediately caused concern for her grandfather. Leaving the shop unattended was not convenient, so the man reassured himself with the thought that his granddaughter had probably just met someone she knew. Surely they got into a conversation, that's why the girl was delayed on the way back. But when more than 20 minutes passed and Graziella still did not appear, her grandfather realized that something was wrong. He decided to personally visit the ill-fated fountain and find out what could have delayed the usually so responsible girl. To his great surprise, neither on the way to the fountain, nor near the fountain itself, Signor Mansi did not notice a trace of his granddaughter. The man even walked around all the surrounding streets, but still could not find the child. This seemed extremely suspicious. Grandfather returned to the outlet, hoping that Graziella was already waiting for him there, because she could have reached it by an alternative route. But the girl was not there either. Half an hour after the disappearance of his granddaughter, he informed the girl's parents, his son and daughter-in-law, about the incident. The man began to call all of Graziella's friends and acquaintances whose phones were known to him. The girl's parents did the same, but soon it became clear that none of their mutual acquaintances had seen the schoolgirl. As a result, in less than an hour, the entire Mansi family gathered on the square near their shop. Several of Graziella's friends also joined the search. Adults and teenagers split into groups and began combing the surrounding streets. The agitation of passers-by attracted the attention of some tourists. Several concerned volunteers joined the search operation. The girl's relatives prudently took her photo from home to show the image to passers-by. Some of them did indeed confirm that during the day they had seen a child similar to the missing one. However, no one could give a clear answer as to where she was heading and what could have happened to her. This quiet and peaceful place had always been considered completely safe, here practically nothing criminal ever happened. Therefore, the assumption that someone could encroach on the life or health of a girl in broad daylight in such a crowded place seemed almost absurd. After several hours of fruitless searches, the Mansi family decided to turn to the local police station. Relatives officially declared the child missing. The servants of the law treated the case with all seriousness. Thus, the Carabinieri joined the search for the missing schoolgirl. A few hours after the incident, a policeman who was patrolling the streets with one of the volunteer detachments was approached by an eyewitness. The man reported that he heard an alarming child scream coming from the Forest Park area located on the outskirts of Castel del Monte. Two policemen went in the indicated direction and noticed plumes of smoke rising from somewhere in the central part of the park. At first they did not associate what they saw with the girl's disappearance, but decided to check what exactly was happening. It was necessary to find out the nature of the ignition and, if necessary, call the firefighters. However, the closer the law enforcement officers approached the source of the fire, the stronger the specific smell of burnt flesh became. And some 10 meters from the fire, the Carabinieri realized that it did not at all resemble an ordinary bonfire. Coming close, the policemen saw that dry branches and leaves were thrown into the fire. And under them something terribly similar to a charred human body was visible. The most terrible thing was the realization that, according to its dimensions, the disfigured remains belonged to a child, and the fragments of clothing on them exactly corresponded to the description of the missing schoolgirl's outfit. The guardians of the law had almost no doubt. In front of them was the lifeless body of the unfortunate Graziella. The flames at that moment had almost burned out, finally destroying all signs of life. Law enforcement immediately began a thorough examination of the area adjacent to the fire. Soon they managed to find several burnt fragments of children's clothing, as well as a lighter, which probably served as a tool for lighting the fire. Unfortunately, nothing else that could shed light on the identity of the criminals was found. The police had high hopes for footage from surveillance cameras installed near the castle. However, it took some time for the investigators to get access to them. Meanwhile, the forensic expert confirmed the worst fears of the detectives: the mutilated body belonged to the missing Graziella Mansi. The autopsy findings could provide comprehensive answers to most questions from both investigators and the girl's relatives, who were exhausted by the unknown. Despite the extremely unsatisfactory condition of the remains, the specialist unequivocally established, the child was killed and the corpse was deliberately burned. The chilling details of this heinous crime spread rapidly through the media. The very next day after the tragedy, journalists literally besieged the Mansi family. When the parents were informed of the terrible news, they initially refused to believe that it was their Graziella. This brazen act of unmotivated cruelty seemed so shocking that it stunned the entire district. The media incessantly replicated the chilling details of the murder committed in the shadow of the castle, famous throughout Italy. The public was seriously frightened by the incident. The number of tourists willing to visit Andria noticeably decreased against the backdrop of gloomy headlines in the press. Guests began to perceive the city as dangerous and avoided its historical monuments in every possible way. All this dealt a tangible blow to the hospitality industry, which fed most of the local population. However, the investigators did not waste time. From the very beginning of the investigation, the police showed great zeal. The main version they adhered to was that the girl was attacked by a rapist. The inhuman lured the child far from busy tourist trails, raped, and then burned her alive to destroy traces of the crime. It is clear that in the life of an 8-year-old girl there could hardly be such dangerous enemies. So, first of all, representatives of the older generation fell under suspicion. Law enforcement officers worked out several versions at once. First of all, they turned their close attention to previously convicted perverts who liked to attack juvenile victims and could have ended up in the vicinity of Andria at about the time the crime was committed. However, the further the investigation progressed, the less likely this direction seemed. The investigators carefully analyzed even the tourist flows, assuming that the killer could be a traveler who was looking for a random prey. Unfortunately, this version also gradually lost relevance. Instead, the more detectives talked with witnesses, friends and acquaintances of the Mansi family, the more often the name of Pasquale Altatore was heard. Everyone in the district knew this 20-year-old young man. He illegally worked as a parking attendant on the very street where Graziella's parents' outlet was located. Many Andrians noticed that since little Mansi began to help her family with the shop, Pasquale did not take his strange gaze off her. Something alarming was heard in the way he looked at the girl. This nuance alarmed several caring citizens at once, so they told the police about their observations. When the investigators talked with Pasquale's friends, they only confirmed the worst fears. Some even jokingly said that the 20-year-old guy had fallen head over heels in love with the 8-year-old girl. But after the tragedy, such statements took on an ominous sound. The suspicion gradually strengthened that Altatore was a perverted predator who had massacred a small victim because of an unhealthy obsession. However, Pasquale's relatives categorically denied such a possibility. He came from a decent family and had never had any problems with the law before. At least, until that fateful evening near Castel del Monte. However, ignoring the assurances of relatives, Altatore became the main suspect as soon as the detectives met with him personally. And the longer the communication lasted, the more their doubts were strengthened. Pasquale was wearing a dirty t-shirt with suspicious brown stains, as if from blood. His face was decorated with scratches, obvious traces of a fight. Although the abrasions were not deep, the investigators quite allowed that they could have been left by small children's hands. Of course, the young man himself denied any involvement in the attack on the girl in every possible way. But the more detectives talked to him, the more often and significantly his version of events changed. It took no more than a few hours from the moment of detention, as Pasquale began to break down. The last doubts among the police were dispelled and the suspect inadvertently blurted out about the incredible beauty of 8-year-old Graziella. For a representative of his age category, it sounded extremely alarming. In addition, a lot of contradictions had accumulated in the testimony of the probable killer. It seemed that the guy was hiding something from justice. According to one of the versions voiced by Pasquale, he was just walking in the park and accidentally came across a child's body engulfed in flames. Frightened, he fled from the scene, and only then the police appeared there. Later, the detainee supplemented his story with new details. Allegedly, he noticed Graziella on the way to the fountain, where she was heading to get water. He greeted the girl, who was not at all afraid of him, because she had often seen him before. At least, until that moment, the guy had always behaved adequately and did not arouse suspicion. According to Pasquale, he told the little one about the puppies that a dog had given birth to in the forest nearby, and offered to look at them. Finally, when the investigators managed to break the suspect, he admitted, in fact, he lured Graziella into the trees, and then set fire to the body in order to get rid of traces of the crime. But Pasquale continued to insist, he supposedly did not intend to rape the child, but only wanted to play some kind of perverted game that got out of control. All these chilling revelations were picked up and savored by the media, adding their own assumptions and unverified details to them. Such information garbage only added additional confusion, because the real motive of the killer still remained a mystery. Despite all these numerous and contradictory testimonies, the story of Pasquale Altatore was far from over. The police wanted to hear his true version of events. There were still many obvious gaps and outright lies in the detainee's story that did not correspond to the evidence collected by the investigation. Pasquale provided the carabinieri with a certain chronology and other valuable information, but continued to evade many questions directly related to the process of the attack and the motives for the crime. It was established that the ignition occurred at about 10 p.m., while the girl disappeared around 7 p.m. What happened during these 3 hours? The main motive for burning the body, according to Altatore, was human voices that he heard nearby. The young man was sure, it was a search group looking for the missing Graziella, so he was afraid of responsibility. But the most terrible fragment of his confessions was information that echoed the conclusion of the forensic expert: the little victim could have been still alive and conscious when the flames broke out. The investigators relentlessly pushed the interrogated. They were puzzled by the fact that despite all the cruelty and scale of the crime, only a few minor scratches were found on Pasquale's body. Is it really possible that he was able to cope with the resistance of a frightened child on his own? Gradually, suspicions were strengthened that Altatore did not act alone, but enlisted the help of accomplices. It was decided to conduct a second interrogation. And now finally the suspect cracked, expressing a desire to cooperate with law enforcement. Allegedly, he wanted to tell the whole truth, which he had previously hidden out of fear. So, according to Pasquale, he lured Graziella into the forest not at all in order to rape or mock her alone. In fact, he was prompted to do all this by a company of 4 young men aged 18 to 20. At the appointed time, Giuseppe Padilla, Vincenzo Caratella, Domenica Margata and Michele Zagaria were already waiting among the trees. Altatore insisted that no one had any sexual violence in mind. He just had the misfortune to lose an argument with these guys. So he had to pay off. His friends allegedly demanded to lure a little girl into their lair. As soon as Graziella found herself in the designated place, all 4 pounced on her. For several hours in a row they mocked the child, not allowing her to leave the forest. They threatened with a brutal reprisal if the hostage began to scream or call for help. But then the kidnappers heard alarming sounds. Someone was actively looking for the missing schoolgirl nearby. Frightened by possible problems with the law, the young men decided to burn Graziella alive. However, they did not have any means of ignition with them. No one volunteered to go for gasoline to the nearest gas station, because it would take a long time. Then they simply beat the girl to unconsciousness, and then tried to set fire to her clothes. But that, obviously, was not enough. Suddenly the victim regained consciousness and screamed. This was the last straw. The kidnappers pounced on Graziella with renewed force, and beat her until she no longer moved. Then they threw fallen leaves over the motionless body, trying to start the burning again with the help of an ordinary lighter. This time the plan worked. The fire quickly engulfed the dead flesh. All the participants in this bloody action were from 18 to 20 years old. According to available information, the young men came from quite decent families, did not belong to marginal circles. That is why their act seemed so horrible and illogical. People who had to communicate with the guys more closely described them as calm and adequate young men who had never been noticed for sadistic tendencies or an inclination for crime. Only one of the entire company had minor problems with the law due to theft. But the atrocity they committed with Graziella did not fit into the head. As soon as Pasquale gave out his accomplices, the carabinieri arrested all 4 without unnecessary fuss. The news of the detention shocked Italy. It was savored in all the media. From the very beginning, the young men categorically denied any involvement in the death of the child. They say they have no idea why they came to the attention of law enforcement. However, the investigators were determined. They were going to continue the interrogations until they found out all the circumstances of that tragic evening in the forest. Unlike Altatore, the other suspects had a clean, unscratched appearance, and no traces of a struggle were found on their clothes. Searches of dwellings also did not provide incriminating materials. The interrogated unanimously asserted, they say that Pasquale Altatore had lost his mind for a long time due to an unhealthy obsession with little Mansi. And they themselves are not involved in anything. Despite exhausting hours-long conversations with investigators, none of the guys blurted out an extra word. Eventually, due to lack of evidence, they had to be released. But the police did not stop watching every step of those involved in the case. The strangest thing was that literally a few days before Altatore's sensational confession, these 4 young men were carrying the coffin at Graziella's funeral. And, according to eyewitnesses, they were crying as if they were really experiencing an irreparable loss. Later, after the arrest, the detainees explained their behavior by a painful shock from the news of the girl's death, whom they allegedly knew. They say that although they did not communicate closely with her, they often saw her in the Mansi shop. The police were wary that all 4 appeared at the memorial service. Investigators assumed, the guys did not just come to the cemetery. Despite the lack of close contacts with the victim's family, they seemed to be tormented by guilt and sought to atone for it. Or maybe the young men were trying to find out at what stage the investigation was. Did anyone suspect their involvement in the murder? Recall that the tragic farewell ceremony attracted the attention of not only townspeople, but also numerous tourists. So the 4 tearful young men simply got lost in the crowd and did not attract undue attention. When the participants were called in for questioning again, law enforcement officers spoke with each one individually. Vincenzo and Giuseppe insisted on their alibi. Allegedly, on the day of Graziella's disappearance, around 7 p.m., they were in the city computer club. But Michelle and Domenica immediately refused to give testimony. They did not want to answer any questions and demanded lawyers. Of course, such behavior only intensified the suspicions of the cops. However, for now they could only check the testimony of the 2 interrogated about the alibi. The detectives went to the mentioned gaming establishment. The employees confirmed, the friends really visited here, but left somewhere in an hour. This time interval was by no means enough to completely secure themselves from accusations. In other words, Vincenzo and Giuseppe could still join the massacre. Absolutely unexpectedly, Michelle and Domenica still confessed to committing the crime. In general, their testimonies coincided with the story told by Pasquale Altatore. As these 2 claimed, their comrades invited them to the forest in the evening allegedly in order to play with fire. Arriving at the place, the newcomers saw that the rest of the company had already gathered in full force. Luring the victim into the trap was assigned to Pasquale. He, of course, chose Graziella, who, according to the observations of many of the guy's friends, aroused unhealthy feelings in him and could become easy prey. The other participants in the orgy hid among the trees, waiting for the arrival of the girl accompanied by the adoptive father. Altatore also confirmed that he intercepted Mansi near the city fountain, where she was just typing water. Then he offered her to look at the puppies that had just been born nearby in the forest. The naive 8-year-old child did not even suspect that this walk would turn into a brutal beating and burning alive for her. Interested in the offer, the schoolgirl agreed to go with Pasquale. He had no difficulty luring the child into the trap. Graziella loved animals very much, so the prospect of seeing newborn puppies aroused great enthusiasm in her. In addition, the girl trusted the familiar young man and did not expect such treachery from him at all. The section of the forest where the kidnapper and his prey were heading was located very close. It took them about 15 to 20 minutes to get to the right place. And meanwhile, Graziella's grandfather should have already started an active search for his granddaughter, worried about her long absence. When Pasquale and the captive reached the agreed point, the other executioners jumped out of their shelters. Seeing them, Graziella experienced real horror. Probably, at that moment the girl realized that she had fallen into a trap. But it was too late, the frail child could not oppose anything to the crowd of sadists. The young men were in a state of mild alcohol intoxication and continued to take swigs from the bottle. For some reason, they were terribly amused and cheered by the fact that Graziella was so scared. According to the testimony of the suspects, no one was going to rape the schoolgirl. The guys just wanted to have fun by bullying an absolutely defenseless girl. The victim was so frightened that she actually fell into a stupor. At some point, someone from the company, without calculating the force, pushed Graziella. She fell, hit her head on a stone and lost consciousness. As the executioners themselves later said, at first they did not plan to burn the captive. The sadists were going to just tie her to a tree to frighten her even more. But when the girl fainted from the blow, it was as if it brought the torturers back to reality. Having decided that the child was dead, the guys panicked. And at this time, human voices reached their ears. Frightened that an active search for the missing schoolgirl had begun, the young men, perhaps due to a mind clouded by alcohol, came up with the idea of destroying all traces of the massacre with the help of fire. The words of the suspects were partially confirmed in the materials of the investigation. In particular, forensic experts still could not find irrefutable evidence of sexual violence. The victim's body had underwear on. Although the genitals had some damage, it probably indicated an attempted rape rather than a completed act. On the other hand, the condition of Graziella's remains was so unsatisfactory that the investigators did not dare to completely reject the version of forced sex. Perhaps the girl was not only tortured, but also dishonored. However, it no longer seemed possible to prove this for sure. The body was so badly burned that, according to the calculations of the Carabinieri, the lion's share of the evidence could have been irretrievably destroyed by the flames. The gang of inhuman people actually counted on this. In the light of this, the version about a sadistic game seemed like outright nonsense. The investigation tried with all its might to prove, in fact, the child was savagely mocked, and the chilling bodily injuries eloquently testified to this. But the detainees still continued to insist on the accidental nature of the tragedy. In the end, the court had to decide the final fate of the young killers. Two members of the gang, Vincenzo and Giuseppe, did not admit their guilt until the end. They claimed that they just came to the forest at the invitation of Tartari. They say they had no idea what was behind the words about the game with fire, and therefore were shocked by what they saw. According to them, both quickly left, because they did not want to take part in this outrage. But even these two could not imagine how that dangerous fun would end. And they were simply afraid to contact the police, either for fear of revenge from their accomplices, or because of unwillingness to have problems with the law if the investigation proved their complicity. Despite all the contradictions in the testimony of those involved, according to the results of the trial, Pasquale Altatore received the least term. He was sentenced to 30 years in prison, and there were two main reasons for this. Firstly, of all the defendants, only Altatore willingly cooperated with the investigation, and his confession played a key role. Secondly, numerous examinations indicated that it was Pasquale who was least involved in burning Graziella's body. Although the young man actively participated in the previous bullying of the victim, the investigators were convinced the fire was set by others. Therefore, the rest of the criminal four faced a much more severe punishment. Found guilty of kidnapping, intentional murder under aggravating circumstances and especially cruel treatment of a child, they were sentenced to the most severe measure of punishment possible, life imprisonment in a solitary cell. Thus, the inhuman people had to spend the rest of their lives behind bars, and without the right to contact other convicts. A gloomy atmosphere reigned in the courtroom when the verdict in the case of the brutal murder of little Graziella Mansi was finally announced. Her mother could not withstand the emotional stress and fainted right on the spectators' bench. Her husband rushed to give her first aid, while the relatives of the convicts tried in vain to calm and support each other. The relatives of the tortured girl believed that the punishment fully corresponded to the gravity of the crime. The only exception was Pasquale Altatore, whose term of imprisonment seemed too mild to them. In the opinion of Graziella's parents, Altatore's guilt was the greatest, because it was he who lured the child into the forest, dooming her to a terrible death. Vincenzo Carratella and Giuseppe Padilla reacted most sharply to the harsh verdict. They continued to insist on their complete innocence, doing it so passionately that, in the end, they managed to find a support group among caring citizens. But even this did not help the young men to appeal the decision of Themis. 8 years have passed since the moment of the tragedy. 27-year-old Vincenzo Carratella, driven to despair and, perhaps, tormented by remorse, decided on a radical step. While behind bars, he managed to inconspicuously bring a bathrobe cord to his cell. It was on it that the convict ended his life. Graziella Mansi's name is still remembered in Italy. Near the Castel del Monte castle, not far from the place of her death, a modest tombstone was installed with a photograph of the girl and a brief account of her sad story. Local residents and tourists often leave lit candles and children's toys there. Of course, family members and friends of the deceased visit this memorial site most often. That's all for now. Please share your thoughts in the comments below. Give this video a thumbs up and be sure to subscribe to my channel so you don't miss any future content. Take care and goodbye.